primitive times, the first reason was survival, to protect yourself against predators that hunted you at night. And through much of our history, we obeyed by those natural laws of activity during the daylight hours and rest at night.
People worked from sun up to sundown, and once the sun went down, it was time to go on off to bed because the world got very, very dark.
The campfire would, of course, be the very first way of lighting. Man is always looking for lighting, you know, and he's looking for warmth. And, of course, man was intelligent enough to put together the idea of, well, goody, if I have a fire, I get the double advantage of heat, I get to cook on it, I also get some light. They also discovered that rushes could be dipped in animal fat, and then they would have these iron devices that would clamp the rush, and they could light that. And so these are fairly early devices that go all the way up, though, into the 18th century. We call probably all those lamps, going from almost prehistory up into the 19th century, wick-supported lamps. And they'll have a reservoir for the oil back here. It could be very, very, very simple, just an open boat, say, with a little spout on the end where they would lay the wick. Candles are being made medieval period. We have lots of references to them. They used tallow, which is an animal fat, to make these sticks. And of course, the original candles that were used for household consumption were tallow, and they were very messy and dirty. And you had to have little wick trimmers to keep them burning. Literally, for about every 4 or 5 minutes, you need to trim your wick to keep the thing burning. The church developed the beeswax candlesticks, which burned much purer and much longer, and they were obviously much more expensive. Then, 1780s, whales, the sperm whales, the oil out of the cavity of its head, and this was very prized because you could make these pure white candles, and these things were very, very, very expensive and only used by the most soignés of families. But that's the kind of thing that you would be seeing in the best households from 1780 right on forward.
It certainly would have been a luxury throughout most of human history. Your average person living in medieval Germany or Europe or something wouldn't have had access to candles or oil lamps. They would have bowed to the natural rhythm of nature. During the 17th and 18th century in large European cities, and also here in America, you would have people, at least in English, known as linkmen. They were essentially like taxi drivers, and you could hire them to walk you through the city streets at night holding a lantern. Just people felt comfortable being lit and to be able to see through the dark. And so that was an important occupation.
In New Orleans, the colonial city, when it got dark, and what little lighting existed, you know, if people went out in the streets, they would carry some sort of a lantern with them or some sort of a little candle.
As early as 1729, 1730, there are accounts of black slaves bearing torches, leading processions through parts of New Orleans, generally going to a party in the evening. They would often guide a group of well-to-do New Orleanians.
The city was beginning to grow into the 1790s. It had a growing business community, had a growing transient population, people coming down the river to sell their goods, so it was necessary to keep some lighting going, and certainly people had lighting in their businesses, but it would have been all oil or candle lighting. Ancient Rome, they had street illumination. Even in the Middle Ages, they were attempting to illuminate streets to some extent, but it wasn't very good. In most cases, once the sun went down, that was it. And of course, once you got outside the city walls, you were in pitch blackness. Governor Carondelet introduced street lighting to the city, and these were just little oil lamps that were strung across the intersections that would hang in the middle of the streets, and they used those for many, many years. And it just provided sort of a flickering light. It would help guide you along the street, but it certainly wasn't bright enough to illuminate anything too much. You had the old lighting men who would go around and light the street lights. That would be before gaslight, and even in cities where you had gas lighting fixtures, you still had hand-lit lights that had to be unlit every morning.
Mardi Gras parades had to be lit at night some way, and they used fuel torches. African American people would lead the parade at that time just to light the parade, and the fluent whites and the floats would follow behind.
It wasn't until the industrial age, when you took the work away from an individual person doing it and you industrialized labor, that you had this demand for large sources of light that could light large spaces of productive work, and that occurred in the early 19th century, primarily in England. London had gaslight available as a consumer product as early as 1810, so London was certainly the most advanced city in the 19th century as far as public lighting goes, but that had to do with the Industrial Revolution being born in England, the availability of coal from which the gas was produced, and also the engineering know-how centered in that area, where you had people that knew how to develop a gas works and could work on the machinery. New Orleans was very early to be introduced to the gas age. The first American city to have gas lighting as a public utility was Baltimore in 1816. Boston was the next city, which followed soon after that, and New Orleans had gas lighting in 1823.
The French Quarter was an easier, closer square in community and population density, so they had a more extensive gaslight system. So although New Orleans was the third city in the United States to have a gaslight system, it was much more extensive than Baltimore's and Philadelphia.
James Caldwell introduced gas lighting to New Orleans. He was an Englishman who came here, and when the American Theater opened, which he built the St. Charles Theater as well. He introduced gas lighting in the building, and it turned out to be extremely popular.
A lot of the articles in the paper about the American Theater dealt with the new innovations in lighting rather than the actual productions that were going on. At that time, the theater was primarily lit by lighting in front of the stage, so that meant that the actors had to be sort of clustered towards that light, and the light would often sort of disfigure their faces, and it became a very unrealistic and awkward presentation. But with gas lighting, you could have large lighting sources above the actors' heads, and you could produce much more intense light, which enabled the actors to use the entire stage, and it gave the presentations more of a three-dimensional look, which was very exciting to theater goers in the 19th century and was a great commercial plus for any theater owner if they could stage these more realistic productions. You saw a lot of theaters early on in the 19th century have portable gas works in their enterprises that could facilitate this new art form, essentially.
They did have a fantastic thing in the French Opera House, which was a 40-foot in diameter gas chandelier.
Caldwell saw that New Orleans had a need for that type of lighting.
He was a very entrepreneurial person and realized that he could market this on a larger scale. So he was the primary mover and shaker behind creating the first gas utility here in New Orleans, and that officially began in 1835.
The city of New Orleans had a gas plant and would pipe the gas into the houses, particularly French Quarter, and then into the American section. They made gas out of coal in a gas plant. And so this was, of course, another big step. It was a brighter light. It was cleaner than the oil lights were. Many of these plantations had coal plants to make gas, to fire their gasoliers. But if you had to build your own gas plant on your plantation, this was very, very expensive. This Christopher Columbus model of gasolier, this one's probably made 1855 and 1861. You can see that there is a pipe would be at the top, and the gas will come down through one of these brass and spelter rods going up to the corona, and then that would feed round to each one of these four arms.
Near the Superdome, underneath where Entergy headquarters is, currently on Poydras, there was a tremendous tank of coal gas, and it was manufactured over there and stored there, and then they had pumps and generators that pumped it actually into the city system.
The gaslight businesses expanded pretty dramatically in the late 1820s and into the 1830s and 1840s because New Orleans was a growing city. People were looking for lighting, and gas was definitely the way to go because gas lighting had been introduced 10 or 20 years earlier in Europe and to the Northeast in the United States. And of course you needed gas for other things too, which were beginning to come out at that time, but primarily lighting. So definitely people were starting to live in a life of gaslight and shadow at the time. You know, it would have made life so different in people's houses with the flickering gaslight and the quivering shadows on the walls and probably the gas warming a room, which would have been very nice in the winter. At the same time, you get a little amount of gas seepage, which probably made people nice and drowsy too. You get a little touch of gas poisoning.
It also became the preferred method of suicide. It didn't take long for people to realize that use of the new technology.
They had extensive interior chandeliers, none of them OSHA approved, so a lot of the houses burned down, had big fires in the quarter. Throughout its history, one, of course, major, that burned most of the quarter, and not necessarily attributed to gas lights, but buildings were lit with gas lighting up until probably the Ralt Center fired.
Gas lighting was throughout most of the 19th century the lighting utility.
There's a standard style of light, which is a four-sided light with panes angled at the bottom and top because they're trying to emit the most lumens out of them without them being blocked by anything. So this basic design of light in glass, open on top and open on the bottom, actually gives you the biggest, most even photometric spread. Now, with that said, in gaslight days, if you had glass on top, because it was cold gas, it would soot up immediately. And then also the glass would break because of the heat. So they had solid copper tops.
And then, of course, there was the discovery of petroleum. In the 1850s, kerosene will come into use, and many of the older oil lamps will be converted to burning kerosene, which will require a different kind of wick. These are probably 1830s, early 1840s, and this is the very kind of thing that they would be buying in New Orleans during that period. You can see the double cylinder here for the wick. The oil flows down and you have a little pump on the side to release it, to let the oil come down, so you can increase the brightness of the flame.
There were a lot of reasons why electric light replaced gas light. Gas light sort of reached a natural barrier because the flame consumed oxygen and there was only so much oxygen in any public space, and also it was giving off small amounts of ammonia and other gases as it burned. So there was this constant demand for brighter and brighter light, but as you increased the number of burning flames, you made people sick.
In the early 1880s, this was one of the first cities, not only in the country but in the world, to introduce arc street lighting.
The earliest photographs of electric lights were wires draped along the riverfront with one big glass ball in the center. So you had this big light bulb to light this whole area here. If you think about it, if there's no light, one light becomes quite a beacon. And then along Canal Street also, they had that same lighting system. And then people started getting a little bit more decorative and long-lasting, because I'm sure the first rain that hit these big light bulbs up there, they broke or popped.
At the 1884 World's Fair on Christmas Eve, the switch was turned on, so all the buildings were outlined with electric light bulbs, and this was the biggest use of electric lighting ever. People just loved it. And here was a city that didn't have a drainage system. It wasn't even thinking of sewage disposal or waterworks system or anything like that, but lo and behold, here we had an electrical system. And by the time you got to the mid-1880s, you had electric street lights strung along St. Charles all the way up to Audubon Park, and street lights stretched all the way up Canal Street to the cemeteries, and half that route was going through really nothing much better than open farmland. So New Orleans was very advanced. One of the newspapers said that New Orleans was as brilliantly illuminated as Paris and London. And it became very popular in New Orleans on Christmas Eve and at Mardi Gras for buildings along Canal Street to be decorated with electric light bulbs. They would just completely surround the buildings with electric lights, and they would turn them on. And it was a big event for people to go downtown on Christmas Eve to see the lights turned on and party on Canal Street. And it was also being made available to businesses and residences. Electric lights were used to illuminate store windows. When Maison Blanche opened in 1897, they were in the old Mercier building on Canal Street. It was the first real New York-style department store in New Orleans, but part of their allure was their electric lighting. They had 130 feet of show window along Canal Street, completely lined in mirrors, and then with thousands of light bulbs. It made New Orleans a 24-hour-a-day city. New Orleans had always been pretty open late at night, but a lot of people, they wanted to be in before the sun went down, because it would have been frightening out in the streets. It would be hard to get around, but here you suddenly have all these electric lights going up. In the 1880s, electric streetcars were beginning to come into use. Here you had faster transportation, electric lights illuminating the streets. It just made life completely different, and of course stores and bar rooms and hotels would just outline themselves in electric light.
Of course, all the rich people at that time started having electric light because it just changed our economy and changed the dynamics of how we live. Electrical appliances and everything that goes with that. The early part of the century, they had gas chandeliers and they had Victorian shades on them and elaborate glass things. They were all pointed up. All the arms, Victorian brass arms, were pointed up at the ceiling. Well, to convert these, they added another brass arm that went down that an electric light bulb could screw into. So you had a gas and electric chandelier, actually. So if the electricity, which was very undependable at that time, any high wind, any tree branch fall on the wire, anything that happened, your electricity goes out, and you had the gas to fall back on. We have lights that have been burning in the French Quarter for over 50 years that have never been out. The first time these lights have been out since my grandfather lit them with a match is for Katrina.
We were the first ones back. There were no neighbors at all back. There was no power or any lights or anything like that, obviously. It definitely did restrict us, not having light.
When the sun goes down and all the light stops, it was really dark.
Being in pitch dark after a certain time was pretty intimidating.
I wasn't that scared because my dad was there and he's really strong and stuff, but I was still a little afraid.
Some people can't do it, but we were prepared to protect ourselves, that's for sure. After a while, we got used to it. We didn't feel threatened. Luckily, a very good friend had a generator. We gassed it up, got it started, and then that gave us a certain amount of power to be able to hang drop lights and work lights. People were attracted to it. People were like coming out of the darkness, walking up to us going, "How'd you get electricity?" It's an experience that we have to live. It was a situation that was handed to us, and we decided we wanted to stay in New Orleans. I think it's worth it, to live in this town.
Yeah, I really like light now because just appreciate it more, and it's just awesome.